The case of Applewhite versus Accuhealth and the City of New York, again, for unintentional tort of negligence by Mallory, Daniel Brins, and Leah Digmann. In 1998, Tiffany Applewhite, a 12-year-old girl, suffered from uveitis, an eye condition that required a prescribed medication to be administered into the veins. A registered nurse from Accuhealth was attending to Applewhite in her home in February with the responsibility of administering a dose of solumedrol, prescribed by a physician to treat Applewhite's eye condition. Applewhite had been taking the medication the entire previous month without incidents. On the day the February infusions began, the only medical equipment brought by the nurse was a blood pressure cuff, a stethoscope, and a one-way breather, which is used during cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Within seconds of administering the medication, Applewhite complained that she could not breathe. The nurse stopped administering the medication and instructed Applewhite's mother to call 911 and send an ambulance. Applewhite then began to experience anaphylactic shock and seizing. The nurse inserted a one-way breather, but Applewhite began to go into cardiac arrest. The nurse began CPR until EMS could arrive. Within minutes of the 911 call, 2 EMTs employed by the City of New York Fire Department arrived at the scene and began basic life support from the ambulance. They were dispatched because no advanced life support ambulances with paramedics were available at the time. One EMT began performing CPR on Applewhite while the other called for an ALS ambulance. It is alleged that at this point, Applewhite's mother then requested EMTs to transport Applewhite to a nearby hospital, but the EMT chose to continue CPR until paramedics and an ALS ambulance arrived on the scene to transfer and treat Applewhite. The ALS ambulance and paramedics injected Applewhite with epinephrine to treat anaphylactic shock and transferred her to a nearby hospital. Applewhite ultimately survived, but suffered serious brain damage.
This case brings up two major questions under the intentional tort of negligence. One, did the nurse and their company, Accuhealth, practice professional malpractice in their care of Applewhite? And two, did the City of New York have a special duty of care in the case of Applewhite's care? The first factors of malpractice were Applewhite's mother claimed that it took 1 minute for the nurse to instruct her to call 911 from the moment Applewhite claimed to have trouble breathing and was 20 feet away taking notes, therefore causing professional malpractice by failing to supervise and attend to Applewhite. Additionally, experts have outlined that the drug monograph for solumedrol identifies that anaphylaxis is a side effect, and when administering the drug, administrator should keep entropine immediately available. Applewhite furthers the claim of professional malpractice by arguing that the nurse should have known the importance of erinopine, as it is commonly known as a treatment for anaphylaxis, and should have had it on her person when coming to the home of Applewhite to administer the medication. Even a lay person would know that an EpiPen should have been used and or present when providing the medication that could possibly cause anaphylaxis. Factors against the malpractice. However, one could argue that it shouldn't have been the nurse's or Accuhealth's duty to ensure the EpiPen was present, but rather the physician who prescribed the medication should have given Applewhite an EpiPen and been present in the household in the case the medication caused anaphylaxis. It was argued that the nurse was not authorized to carry erinopine without a specific order from a physician. Additionally, the nurse from Accuhealth, in each and every aspect of her treatment of the plaintiff, acted well within the standards of good and accepted nursing practice.
The second argument of this case is that the City of New York performed negligence in their care of Applewhite. The city argued that they did not owe a special duty of care to Applewhite and that the actions of the EMS and ALS teams were not the cause of Applewhite's damages, but rather the allergic reaction to the drug administered by Accuhealth was the cause of the damages. They also went on to argue that there is no causation in fact, that regardless of the act performed by the City of New York's personnel, Applewhite would still have suffered physical damages due to the allergic reaction from the Solu Medru. Therefore, the actions of the personnel were not the proximate cause of harm. Finally, the city argued that the emergency medical services are a government function, as they require proof of a special duty as a basis for liability. Applewhite's team argued that the City of New York was negligent because they administered ambulance services through the fire department and not directly by medical personnel. They also argued that the EMS personnel were allegedly negligent in their medical care and that the medical care does not fall under a government function, meaning it is not free of liability. Additionally, it was argued that the EMS decided to wait 20 minutes for the ALS ambulance to arrive instead of immediately transporting Applewhite to the hospital. Additionally, the EMS assuring the mother that it would be better to wait for an ALS ambulance established a special relationship through the promises and actions to act on behalf of Applewhite. So what were the outcomes of this case? Accuhealth ultimately dissolved into bankruptcy, causing Applewhite to discontinue their claims. The lawsuit against the nurse for malpractice was negotiated in a pre-trial settlement that was not disclosed. In the original case against the City of New York, the Supreme Court granted New York City's motion that Applewhite could not prove that the city owed them a special duty or that the municipal personnel were the proximate cause of harm. However, the appellate division reversed and reinstated the claims against New York City, determining that while the city's emergency medical response was governmental, Applewhite raised triable concerns that the city assumed a special duty to them after the EMS personnel made a promise that Applewhite should wait for the ALS ambulance rather than be taken to the hospital. This was then also upheld by the Court of Appeals.